Hey everyone, thanks for your time. Before we get too far into the second quarter of 2025, here's where things stood with NASA's Artemis exploration programs at the end of the first quarter of 2025, as we wait to see what President Trump and Elon Musk plan to do with NASA and Artemis going forward. There were three major themes during the first quarter of 2025. The beginning of the year was the beginning of President Trump's second term, more or less, and the new administration's overhaul of the federal executive branch still threatens the future of Artemis. During the first quarter, the primary actions were job cuts, going in the proverbial different direction in the case of Artemis upper management, but more generally slashing workforce. As the first quarter ended and the second quarter begins, there's no resolution to the uncertainty about the future of Artemis and NASA created by the election in November and the change in power in January. Obviously, we're still watching to see what changes Trump and Elon Musk plan for Artemis. At this point, with a wide range of rumors and not much comment on the record by the administration or Congress, we may have to wait until the fiscal year 2026 budget request is released, maybe longer. Musk suddenly proposed an early end to the International Space Station, which broadened the overall uncertainty into those programs and may have slowed down the overall policy rollout timeline. Just after the second quarter started, the U.S. Senate hearing on the nomination of Jared Isaacman to be the next NASA administrator was scheduled for April 9th, and the latest reporting projected that the budget would be released in mid-May. At the end of the quarter, the Wall Street Journal published a story citing several sources that aligns with previous rumors that the administration is planning an Artemis overhaul. The rumors were that all the Artemis programs would be defunded by Trump and Musk, and the budget would be reprogrammed for commercial Mars transportation. That would include Musk's Starship HLS contract. However, SpaceX has already completed and been paid for most of the negotiated front-loaded milestones. Milestone payments for the major tech demonstrations and functionality that NASA is depending on, including a propellant transfer demonstration, an uncrewed lunar landing demo, and the crewed lunar landing as a part of Artemis III, would amount to less than half of the overall value of the contract. The second major theme for Artemis during the quarter was launch preparations for Artemis II, which is the crewed lunar flyby mission. SLS stacking and Orion final assembly progress were self-evident during this period of preparations, where large-scale installations took place. Orion solar arrays and service module fairings were installed, and the SLS boosters and core stage are now stacked on the mobile launcher in the vehicle assembly building. Those highly visible final assembly and vehicle integration milestones provide some clarity about progress and the current status, but it's too early to say whether launch can be moved up from April 2026. As I've reported from recent interviews with NASA officials, we know how they plan to make an end-of-the-year rollout. They want to complete Orion processing in 5 months this time, and they are combining all the testing at the pad into a single pad flow with the launch countdown. But now we have to see about execution of that plan. The third theme of the quarter was the 2 back-to-back Starship flight test failures, which slowed down overall development progress and delayed hopes to accelerate Starship testing farther into 2025. We went into the quarter hoping to see the first orbital flight test attempted. However, that milestone will have to wait until later in the year now, as the first 2 Starship prototype flight tests of the year exploded before launch could be completed. Artemis II production and launch processing was in the news through most of the quarter, but especially in February and March, and I've covered each of the milestones in depth as they were reported. Looking at the current status from a big picture perspective, Exploration Ground Systems has received almost all of the flight hardware for stacking, but preparations for stacking and stacking itself started last year. Currently, EGS Integrated Operations has physically stacked the SLS boosters and core stage on Mobile Launcher 1 in High Bay 3 of the vehicle assembly building. The Launch Vehicle Stage Adapter, or LVSA, is currently parked in High Bay 4, and it will be the next element to be lifted into High Bay 3. EGS Spacecraft Offline Operations is processing the SLS in-space second stage, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS, in the Multi-Payload Processing Facility. The remaining elements to be turned over to EGS for processing are Orion and the Orion Stage Adapter. Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin is finishing final assembly and test of the Artemis II spacecraft in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building, with handover to EGS still advertised in late April. The solar arrays and service module fairings are now installed, which leaves installation of the forward bay cover and final closeouts left. Following the official handover, the spacecraft will be moved to the MPPF for commodity loading. EGS is currently preparing the ICPS in the transfer aisle of the MPPF for servicing of its attitude control system hydrazine tanks, and the plan remains to complete that activity in April and vacate the MPPF before Orion arrives. The OSA is now forecast to be transported from Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville to KSC in the late spring, which ends in mid to late June. The OSA is the payload-specific SLS adapter for the rocket's Block 1 configuration. Once that is handed over to EGS, the SLS program will still be participating in support of EGS launch processing, but specific work for the SLS program will focus on the remaining traveled work on the core stage. That includes reinstallation of engine controllers on the RS-25 engines, changeout of the number 4 engine in the stage, and modifications to resolve the vortex or ascent vibration issues seen during the Artemis I launch. Right now, the expectation is that strakes will be installed on either side of the forward booster to core stage attach points. The near-term forward outlook is for those upcoming moves to take place. Those could still be preceded by stacking of the LVSA with ICPS hydrazine servicing and then roll from the MPPF to the VAB for its stacking. Then Orion would roll from the ONC building to the MPPF at the end of April. Once those moves are complete, the launch processing activity will continue on a smaller scale into the summer. Lifting the SLS pieces and bolting them together is the beginning of integration rather than the totality of it. The connections between stages, boosters, and the mobile launcher are complicated and will take some weeks to fully validate. Once those umbilicals are plugged in, then the launch team will go through an end-to-end checkout of the command and control chain from the Launch Control Center computer systems to the vehicle computer systems. That work on SLS is expected to run through most of the summer. Meanwhile, the Orion commodity loading in the MPPF is allocated 3 months through July, and then stacking of the launch abort system and encapsulation of the crew module together are allocated 2 months through September or thereabouts. The plan is to have Orion ready to stack on SLS also by the end of the summer. Following that progress is going to be what we're watching over the next 2 quarters and 6 months. If Artemis III remains on the books through 2025, then the focus will be on Starship, given its higher visibility development, which is both critical to Musk's Mars ambitions in only 18 months, and also to SpaceX's commitment to NASA to support a mid-2027 lunar landing. The Starship development roadmap became even more uncertain with the slowdown in progress due to the recent incomplete tests. However, the other programs that the Artemis III schedule depends on also have varying levels of schedule uncertainty too. As the second quarter begins, SpaceX continues to prepare the next ship and booster prototypes for the 9th Starship flight test. After the back-to-back flight tests that were terminated during ascent, it's not yet clear where the company is debugging the issues they are having with the upgraded main propulsion system of the upgraded ship. While that's uncertain, the bigger picture uncertainty for Artemis is when will there be a version of Starship that can do work for customers like NASA. The propellant transfer demonstration between 2 ships in low Earth orbit will be the first big flight test for NASA and Artemis, but SpaceX has not said anything about their schedules going back more than a year. The most recent updates were from NASA about a year ago. The very latest was in a social media post from Musk before the last test flight that hinted at a delay of prop transfer until 2026, but provided no details. Regardless of the fate that Trump and Musk want for Artemis and returning to the moon, that ship-to-ship propellant transfer is critical to Musk's goal for the Starship program to launch to Mars in the next transfer window, which opens in about 18 months. There were no updates from Axiom Space on the development status for the lunar surface spacesuits they will provide for Artemis III. We're still waiting to hear about the critical design review, and prior to that, a human-in-the-loop vacuum test of the suit design. Both the review and test that comes before the CDR were anticipated this year in 2025. Moving to exploration ground systems, they are not planning any major upgrades to hardware or software between Artemis II and III. All the improvements to the mobile launcher and software and hardware upgrades to ground infrastructure for Artemis II would carry over, so direct work for Artemis III won't begin until after Artemis II launches, when EGS will refurbish the hardware and fix any software issues that come up during the Artemis II launch campaign. For the Artemis III Orion, the most recent news came out of the Artemis I heat shield investigation. That concluded in the previous quarter, the last of 2024. By the time the investigation officially concluded in early December, the Orion program had already shipped the Artemis III Orion heat shield to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville to have its AVCOAT blocks stripped off the carrier structure. The last look at the crew module and service module was recently in early March. The service module is through its proof pressure testing of the crew module adapter to European service module welds, so those two elements of the module are now integrated. The crew module is also in integration, and NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs said that the initial power-on, or IPO milestone, was planned for the quarter beginning now, the second quarter or spring in the Northern Hemisphere. The IPO for the service module is currently planned for the summer. Those are the two major pieces of the spacecraft, but the crew module is missing a couple of significant elements. The heat shield, which has been a focus of attention for the last 2 years due to the investigation, and also the docking mechanism, which is new to Orion for Artemis III. The status for those two elements is not as clear. Johnson Space Center Public Affairs says that the heat shield is still in Huntsville going through the machining and inspection process. The heat shield carrier would be shipped back to KSC following that, but we don't know whether they are still working on machining at this point or inspections. For the NASA docking system, that was said to still be crated back in December when I last got a chance to ask. During the quarter, I got a little update on the status of Orion launch abort system hardware for Artemis III. The abort motor is complete and awaiting shipment to Kennedy Space Center. That is one of 2 motors that Northrop Grumman produces. The other is the attitude control motor. Buildup of that element is in work with delivery still to be determined. L3 produces the jettison motor, and PAO says that delivery of that is currently expected in late April, early May of this year, 2025. Production of the motor adapter truss assembly, or MATA, for Artemis III is also in work with a delivery date to be determined. A structural test version of a MATA is seen in this still image taken at NASA Glenn Research Center in Ohio. They form the structural connection between the LAS motor tower with the 3 solid rocket abort motors and the crew module, the MATA cone being the adapter from the tower and the truss assembly below attaching to the crew module itself. As seen in this diagram, other elements like the fillet panels, interstage elements of the tower, nose cone, and the ogive panels will also be completed and delivered to KSC for assembly of the Artemis III LAS unit later. There is also an L3 newsroom update on the jettison motors that goes back to last August, saying that the solid rocket propellant had been cast for the Artemis III and Artemis IV units. That's one of the big milestones in production of the motor, but there's still more work, and as the update that I got in February noted, the Artemis III jettison motor is forecast to be delivered in this quarter. For SLS, the big picture hasn't changed. It's worth repeating from the last quarterly update that with the exception of the core stage, most of the Artemis III rocket is basically ready for stacking or stacking preps. The solid rocket booster motors and exit cones are complete and in storage in Utah, and the forward and aft assembly hardware are almost done. At the KSC media event in December, Northrop Grumman officials said that the aft skirts have already been hot-fired and they are basically completing documentation. Similarly, the SRB forward assemblies for Artemis III should have their documentation filled out by the middle of 2025. Likewise, the ICPS, LVSA, and OSA for Artemis III are complete and in storage. The LVSA and OSA will need to be transported to KSC, but the target launch date was pushed out, and we're still over 2 years away from the no earlier than mid-2027 date. That's also the case for the RS-25 engines for Artemis III, which were left over from the Space Shuttle program. Those were ready for the mission 2 years ago in the spring of 2023. The recent decision to swap one of those engines with one of the Artemis II engines means there could be a little servicing work on one of them. However, there is plenty of time between now and when the engines are needed for installation in Core Stage 3. L3Harris already has the Artemis IV engines ready to go, in addition to the ones for Artemis III, so theoretically, if that fourth set of engines were needed today, they could use them too. It also has not changed that the Artemis III core stage is the last item that SLS needs to complete building to be ready for the mission. As before, from a big picture standpoint, both major subassemblies are critical to the core stage 3 build schedule, the engine section and the quote-unquote 4/5 part of the stage. That's the forward skirt, liquid oxygen tank, inner tank, and liquid hydrogen tank. During the quarter, the updates we got on production primarily were for the propellant tanks, which are pacing items for the elements at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans. The liquid hydrogen tank is in Cell N getting its spray-on foam insulation acreage sprays. Those are done by an automated system, and Cell N was reactivated over New Year's after being offline for most of 2024. At the end of February, Boeing said that 2 of the 4 SOFI sprays were completed. After all of them are completed, then all the masking has to be removed. There are trims and sanding, and also an automated process to trim the foam where the system's tunnel base plates will be attached to the tank. The forecast is for that work to be completed sometime in this quarter, the second quarter. The liquid oxygen tank would go in there next. According to the latest update from Boeing, the tank finished its final primer spray next door in Cell P in Building 131 in late March. After the dome and barrel primer sprays are tested, the tank would be ready to move. During this second quarter that is starting, both tanks should be moved, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that pictures are available after that. We can use these old graphics to look at the overall current status of this build, starting with the forward join, which initially mates the top 3 elements. The 2 dry elements of those 3, the inner tank and forward skirt, are mostly finished with their standalone integration and have been mostly waiting for the LOX tank to reach readiness for the forward join. The inner tank is being temporarily stored in the final assembly area of Building 103. Standalone functional testing will resume when the LOX tank is ready for the forward join. Standalone functional testing of the forward skirt will also resume after testing of the inner tank. The LOX tank still needs application of its primer and foam completed. Then an internal sensor mast will be installed with the cryogenic level sensors for the tank. That would be followed by installation of the sump at the bottom of the tank, which will need to be rotated to vertical to complete that task. The tank would then need to be rotated back to horizontal for final pre-join work. For the LH2 tank, it would go through a similar sequence, except that it is going through SOFI sprays in Cell N right now, as noted earlier. The LH2 tank's cryogenic level sensors would also be installed inside, followed by attachment of the aft manifold to the bottom of the tank. In contrast to the LOX tank, the aft manifold can be installed while the tank is horizontal. The question this year is to see how far the Core Stage 3 work progresses in New Orleans and Florida. For the 4/5 subassembly in production at MAF, the question is when will it be ready to ship to Kennedy Space Center. In order to get there, the LH2 tank would need to be stacked with an engine section simulator that will now serve as ground support transportation equipment. Then, once the LOX tank is ready, the forward join would be started, bolting the inner tank, LOX tank, and forward skirt together. That would be followed by the last mater join at MAF, where the forward join would be attached to the aft join, bringing together the top 4 elements of the stage along with the engine section simulator. There would still be some outfitting of the mated 4/5 subassembly necessary before it would be ready to ship. It would be an optimistic forecast for that shipment to KSC by the end of this year, but we will see how far things have progressed at the end of the next quarter, and hopefully we'll get some updates on milestones. The final join is now the engine section with the rest of the stage. Mating those two together will now be done vertically at the Kennedy Space Center in the newly opened Core Stage Vertical Integration Center in VAB High Bay 2. Engine section integration is continuing at KSC in the Space Systems Processing Facility, or SSPF. We got a few pictures of the element in the SSPF back in January, showing the outside of the engine section with the boat tail extension mated. Almost all of the equipment is inside though, which we can't see. The latest update from Boeing was that they are working on electrical integration work, which is installation and routing of wire harnesses. At the end of the first quarter of 2025, the completion date is now called quote-unquote under review, so it's also optimistic to forecast that the engine section could be completed in 2025. Since we last heard a schedule for this build, Artemis III was delayed a significant amount of time, so we'll have to see if a new official schedule for Core Stage 3 completion, or interim milestones, is released. The forward outlook for Artemis III remains cloudy. With the exception of Artemis II preparations, all of the watch items from Starship development to Orion and SLS production are updated infrequently or basically not at all. For Starship, the near-term schedule is in greater doubt due to the recent flight test setbacks. Going into the year, it was unclear when the first orbital flight test would occur, either which flight test or when on the calendar that is scheduled. That's still the case, but now it's harder to know how many more flight tests need to be conducted and/or completed before Starship is ready for that first orbital attempt. Given no significant updates from Axiom Space on their moonwalk spacesuit, there's no change to the outlook for that or its uncertainty. We're waiting to hear about the vacuum test and critical design review this year. We have a few near-term milestones to measure Orion and SLS core stage production against, but it's harder to tell long-term when those will be ready for Artemis III launch processing. Realistically, looking at how the Artemis II plans are shaping up, they would both need to be nearing completion a year before launch. A mid-2027 target date is a little more than 2 years away, so there's a little more than a year's worth of time to complete that production by the middle of 2026. So, longer term, just as the big picture is pretty much the same, uncertain, the question marks about the outlook remain pretty much the same too. It's hard to say that mid-2027 is realistic with the minimal information being provided and the minimal information being regularly updated. The Starship setbacks probably cement its critical path status for now, but that could change this year depending on what happens with all the programs. If Starship doesn't get to its propellant transfer demonstration until 2026, then that means that its Artemis HLS critical design review would also be delayed into 2026. The CDR was previously expected for both the lunar lander and the moonwalk spacesuit this year, 2025. So all the question marks for Artemis III are still there, from Starship to SLS. It's still hard to tell how close or how far all the programs are from their schedules, and that mixed messaging of completing milestones with little context to go on continues. What's changed a little bit this quarter is that the chances for further delays to the Starship schedule have increased. Considering that there are rumors that Artemis will be canceled, we're going to find out about that before we find out about another Artemis III delay. Artemis IV is planned as a gateway assembly and lunar landing mission that would involve all the Artemis III elements, but also brings in Gateway. The first launches related to the mission are Gateway launches that are critical to the mission. First, the initial 2 Gateway elements, the power and propulsion element integrated on the ground with the habitation and logistics outpost, will launch on a Falcon Heavy commercial booster. The fully expendable Falcon Heavy for this mission can't inject the 18 metric ton Gateway co-manifested vehicle on a translunar trajectory. It will insert the spacecraft into an elliptical Earth orbit with a lower apogee of about 34,000 kilometers. From there, the PPE will use its solar electric propulsion system to spiral out to the Gateway orbit, also known as a near rectilinear halo orbit. That transit will take about a year. After the PPE and Halo are in the Gateway orbit, and before the Artemis IV crew launches with Orion and the International Habitation Module on SLS, 2 more SpaceX spacecraft would head for the Gateway. First, a Dragon XL spacecraft would be launched to rendezvous and dock with the Gateway to deliver additional logistics for the mission. Then, the second Starship lunar lander would be launched and refueled in Earth orbit to make the trip to the Moon and to Gateway. Then, the official Artemis IV mission would begin with the first SLS Block 1B launch. The upgraded launcher would inject Orion and the IHAB on a translunar trajectory, and Orion would bring the IHAB to Gateway. It would dock IHAB to one of the Halo docking ports and leave it there as a permanent module. The big picture hasn't changed much in the last quarter for Artemis IV either. The Artemis IV target date of September 2028 hasn't been officially updated recently, and that could still be in jeopardy depending on all the elements in development or construction that need to be completed. In the 2 years since the September 2028 date was established, Artemis II and III have been delayed twice. Mobile Launcher 2 construction probably remains the most visible activity of all the Artemis IV elements, but there were a few updates. Work will continue, but the big question about the overall future of Artemis still overshadows progress made on milestones. During the first quarter of 2025, we saw some new footage of the Gateway co-manifested vehicle elements, which are the initial 2 elements, the PPE and the Halo. We saw some late 2024 footage of the PPE in assembly by prime contractor Maxar, but there wasn't any detailed update on its progress. At the end of the quarter, NASA posted on social media that one of the 3 12-kilowatt Advanced Electric Propulsion System engines had been shipped to Glenn Research Center for testing. That is one of the steps towards eventual delivery to Maxar for installation on the PPE. As I record this, the Halo module was being transported from Thales Alenia Space in Italy to the US. Structural assembly of the Halo frame and installation of some additional structures was completed at TASI, and now the frame is headed to a facility of prime contractor Northrop Grumman's in the Phoenix area for integration/outfitting. We finally got a little update on the Dragon XL cargo logistics spacecraft that SpaceX is under contract to develop for Gateway. Jeff Faust reported for Space News back in late January on remarks by the head of NASA's Gateway Logistics program at a conference at the time. The NASA official said essentially that Dragon XL had been redesigned and that the contract has been modified. However, there were no further details. During the past few months, NASA updated its public-facing target launch date for the Gateway CMV to no earlier than 2027. Which is getting closer and closer to alignment with the December 2027 estimate that was calculated in late 2023 as a part of the most recent key decision point. December 2027 would be too late for the official Artemis IV launch date of September 2028, since there isn't enough time for the PPE to get the elements from the Earth to the Moon in time. But Artemis could be seeing significant changes this year, and at this point, rescheduling Artemis IV would be a minor change. Artemis III has already moved to mid-2027, and it could slide even more. During the quarter, there was a media event at Thales Alenia Space in Italy to mark completion of Halo structural work there, and structural elements of the International Habitation Module were seen. However, not much status was reported. There also has been little reported about the Option B upgrades to the Starship lunar lander since last year. Preliminary design review was expected this year, but key changes may depend on rapid iteration of the Option A design to incorporate improvements that fly for the first time on Artemis III. For exploration ground systems, Mobile Launcher 2 is the primary focus of development for Artemis IV right now. The new mobile launcher for SLS Block 1B and Block 2 is under construction by prime contractor Bechtel at the Launch Complex 39 East Park site at Kennedy Space Center. Last year, the base platform structure was built out to the point where it could be set on the East Park site pedestals, and then the base of the umbilical tower, also called the chair, was then constructed on the ML's platform. Beginning this quarter, partially outfitted subassembly modules are being lifted and stacked to build out the umbilical tower. The modules are numbered 4 through 10, and so far we've seen modules 4 and 5 lifted into place. While the remaining modules are being outfitted in the KSC industrial area prior to being lifted, in parallel outfitting of all the internal and external equipment to make the ML a working machine is continuing for the platform and the partially assembled umbilical tower. EGS is also working on construction and testing of the umbilical arms and plates that will be used on ML2. Those will be added after the umbilical tower is topped out. Artemis IV is the first flight of the SLS Block 1B upgrade, and completing development of those elements will drive Space Launch System readiness for that launch. That includes the obvious exploration upper stage and the new connectors needed for that, the inner stage that connects EUS to the core stage, and the universal stage adapter that connects Orion to EUS. However, that also critically includes a major upgrade of the SLS flight software, which is developed within NASA Marshall Space Flight Center Engineering. To get to that first flight of EUS and Block 1B, the SLS program is working to finish design, development, test, and evaluation, DDT&E, and is assembling the structures for final testing and flight. Primary elements of the structural test articles, or STAs, are being welded and bolted together right now. During the quarter, these are the updates we got from prime contractor Boeing on the EUS and interstage STA elements. Welding of the two-piece liquid oxygen tank at Marshall Space Flight Center has started. The second of two welds of the liquid hydrogen tank aft dome is in progress at the machine assembly facility in New Orleans, and welding of the LH2 tank forward dome gore body is also in progress. In addition, as seen in recent online pictures, the EUS STA aft adapter welding was in progress, with the L-rings being welded to that barrel. Once that is complete, it will allow further assembly of the mid-body, which structurally connects the two propellant tanks. So right now for the EUS STA, the pieces of the propellant tanks are still being welded, which is a step prior to welding the tanks together themselves. Parts for the other elements like the mid-body are arriving at MAF, and once the aft adapter welding is completed, assembly of that could start. All the elements will end up in the gray box area at Michoud to be outfitted for final assembly. For the inner stage, the two STA barrels have been welded in the vertical weld center. Those will eventually go to the vertical assembly center for ring-to-barrel and barrel-to-barrel welds. We didn't get an update on universal stage adapter status this past quarter. For completion of the EUS STA, we also couldn't get an update, but it's likely under review like other builds. The previous estimate was to complete it around the end of this year, early next, which is still optimistic. The existing base elements of SLS, the solid rocket boosters and core stage, are under construction. The 10 solid rocket motor segments are in production by Northrop Grumman at their Promontory facilities in northern Utah, and Boeing is assembling Core Stage 4 in facilities at MAF and the Kennedy Space Center. There wasn't any update on booster production during the quarter, but most of the segments are already cast, and the boosters aren't a critical path item. For core stage production, the engine section for Core Stage 4 was set up in the Space Systems Processing Facility at KSC in October, and integration of that unit resumed after transportation from MAF in New Orleans. Boeing's ambition is to finish that stage in a couple of years by the end of 2026, but that is also an optimistic goal. A lot will depend on progress finishing the Artemis III hardware before that. Boeing was planning to finish major structural welding of the core stage elements at MAF in the first half of 2025, so that will be something to continue tracking. For Orion, we got another visual of the Artemis IV Orion crew module primary structure around the last KSC media event at the beginning of March. But otherwise, there isn't a lot of news on the status of any of the elements for the Artemis IV build. The European service module for the mission is probably the farthest along in production. Since prime contractor Airbus delivered ESM-3 to NASA at the end of last summer, they are now in integration and test for ESM-4. In terms of the near-term outlook for Artemis IV, the Gateway Halo module is currently being flown to Arizona, and we're starting to see exploration upper stage structural test article welding. So far, 2 of the 7 Mobile Launcher 2 umbilical tower modules have been stacked, and we're expecting the third relatively soon. But beyond that, it's very difficult to tell how healthy the Artemis IV schedule is overall or for the individual programs. We are seeing some progress with milestones noted, but there's still little context to put those completed milestones in any perspective. For Artemis V and beyond, or at least for those existing plans, work continues mostly in private. During the quarter, we saw completion of the first RS-25 production restart flight engine and the beginning of major production for Core Stage 5, which would fly on Artemis V. RS-25 engine 20001 was delivered from L3 Harris to the RS-25 single-engine test stand at Stennis Space Center for an eventual hot fire acceptance test. Welding of the engine section barrel for Core Stage 5 was also completed. However, that is just the beginning of production, and it doesn't seem like the goal of completing production in 3 years is on the board yet. That would put completion in early 2028, so we'll see. Artemis V would be the first crewed lunar landing made with the Blue Origin team's lunar landing system. That HLS provider system is also based on an Earth orbit rendezvous architecture, except that the Blue Moon cryogenic fluid management is based on liquid hydrogen storage for its fuel. A cislunar transporter made by Lockheed Martin would be refueled from the ground and then shuttle back and forth between Earth orbit and the Gateway orbit to refuel the Blue Moon lander there. All the launches in their architecture would be performed by the New Glenn launch vehicle, which made its inaugural launch at the beginning of the quarter in mid-January. The vehicle successfully placed a payload simulator into a high apogee demonstration orbit, which was the primary objective. A first-stage recovery demonstration was unsuccessful, but Blue Origin says they can make a second flight by the end of this quarter or the end of the spring. Artemis V is still scheduled for the beginning of the next decade, with at least some additional delays being almost guaranteed in the next 5 years. Since we're still not getting much news about missions that aren't scheduled until the next decade, even though we're only at the beginning of the second half of this decade, the focus this year will likely be on the possible jeopardy some of those long-term plans are in right now. As always, thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. And consider subscribing to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Your donations will make it possible to make more field trips to NASA centers and contractor facilities here in the US. I also recently added memberships to this YouTube channel, and I want to thank all the people who have joined so far. I am planning on posting additional videos there and more frequent updates on what's happening during the week. I included a separate link to join in the description, but you can also click on the join button on this page above the description, and there's also a place to join on the channel homepage. Thanks for your support.